What's going on, guys? And in today's video, I wanted to continue the theme of some strange things that had happened to my family members. And I really wasn't going to share these stories, but I was on Reddit and I was sharing one of the stories with another person on there, and he thought the actual story was pretty cool. So I thought I would talk a little bit about that one and share a couple others that went along with it. Now, the first story that I'm going to share with you, it actually was a story that was told to me by my grandmother. This occurred when she was very young, and this would have taken place in this rural southeastern part of Kentucky back in 1930, or in the 30s rather. And at this time in this area, there were very few people that actually had a job, and most people, they just grew gardens and lived off the land. And the few people that did have a job really did not make a whole lot of money. So seeing cars, while it wasn't unheard of, it certainly wasn't common. Now, this took place on a Sunday evening. It was after church, and my grandmother and her aunt were walking along a trail that ran alongside a creek. And as they came to the end of this trail, it went up a short hill, and then you had to take a left that went across a bridge and on down the road toward their family member's home that they were going to. Now, as my grandmother got to the edge of the bridge, she said she noticed that there was a car that sat parked on the side of the road. And as they went by, they noticed that there was a man sat in the passenger side seat, but there was no one in the driver's seat. My grandmother said she had just figured the man had gotten tired from driving and got in the passenger side to rest his eyes. And they continued on their journey, really didn't think any more of it. They had their supper, and then at that point they were coming back home later that evening. It was getting close to dark, and my grandmother said she remembers seeing the car again. And where it was getting later in the evening, she was too scared to even look in the direction of the car, and she just continued on across to the bridge. And as they were getting ready to step onto the bridge, my grandmother said she heard the car behind them starting to move. She looked back thinking that they were just turning around to head in the other direction possibly, and she noticed that the car was actually coming toward them. Now her and my aunt, they both ran to the other side of the bridge and quickly cut down the little path that ran along the creek. And as they got to the bottom of the hill, the car had stopped at the top, and the person that was in the passenger side seat was now running down the hill chasing them. Luckily enough, that little bit of time gave my grandmother and her aunt enough time to get out of the view of the man, and they were able to take the left to their home, and the man continued running straight along the creek bank. Now, it was about 5 minutes later when my grandmother got home. She ran in and she told her father what she had saw and what her and her aunt had experienced, and he went down to the creek to look around and see what was going on. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to find anything at the creek bank that night. And the next day, when he went to the road where the car had sat parked, there was nothing there either. Now, the thing that my grandmother says worries her the most about this is the fact that when they came through earlier that day, the driver was nowhere inside. She was wondering what that driver was doing, and was there another body, or did they have another victim possibly? I mean, at this time, we're talking in the 30s, there was very little in terms of a police force in this area. So hiding a body would not have been very difficult. One thing's for certain though, had my grandmother and her aunt not gotten away from these individuals, they would have certainly been the next victims. Now, the second story that I'm going to talk to you about was told to me by my uncle, and it's a fairly short story, but I'm going to give you as much detail about the setting and the actual school that I can, based on what I've seen and things like that. I've not actually seen the school because by the time I was actually at this area, the school had been long tore down. But it did sit on a mountainside, and there was like a little basement, and then of course as you got further back, it was more of a crawl space that was beneath the school. And one day, my uncle and his friends were in the school. They were sat in the back because this was a one-room schoolhouse now. And the way it was, the younger kids sat in the front and the older kids were sat in the back. And my uncle said that they had looked down and they had noticed that there were a set of eyes looking up at them. And the kid that was sitting beside my uncle got startled and actually dropped his pencil. And when he bent over to pick it up, a hand came up through the floorboards and actually scratched the kid. And they said you could actually hear the person beneath the floors actually sucking the blood off of their fingertips. And what my uncle had told me was that there was a tale that on back up on top of the mountain from where the actual school sat, there was a one-room shack that a witch lived in, and it was believed that the witch had came down that day trying to steal a young child to drag back to their home and possibly eat. I'm not really sure how long the school has been tore down. I just know that when I was maybe 11 was the first time that I was there, 11 or 12, I was around that age, and I'd seen the actual foundation of where the school was. And I can tell you that, there is a path that leads up behind the school building onto the mountain, but I did not go up there, of course, because at that age, my parents would not let me go up this path. And of course, I couldn't get anyone that was older to go with me because they were off doing their own thing. But it's definitely a spooky area. I was there, and at night, as I remember this very well, as I was actually leaving that night, how dark it was in this area. There's a lot of trees, and the canopies of the trees, of course, overcast everything. So on night, even if it's a clear night and the moon is out, it's very, very dark and you can't see really anything in front of you. So it's definitely a creepy area. And it's one of those places that I would not, at least at the time, I would not have liked to have been there as a child. And I think today there's actually a cemetery that's sitting on that spot of land. I'm not really sure about that. I will go up there the next time I visit my mother. I will go up because it's actually up the holler from where she is, and I'll try to get some photos for you guys and, see what you think. See if you think it's creepy as well. Now, this last story that I'm going to talk about, it actually came from a different uncle. And at this time, my uncles, they were all working in Ohio. And they would go up to Ohio. They would work in a foundry during the week. And then on the weekends, they would come back home. And, they all had their different muscle cars and things, because this was like in the mid to late 60s. So we had uncles, that some of them would have, road runners. Others would have like Cougars and Mustangs and Chevelles, Camaros, things like that. And they would all come down and hang out with their friends back home in Kentucky here. And they would have little drag races and things during the weekend. And this actually occurred on a Saturday night. And my uncles, after they had got done having some fun, racing a little bit, they decided to go hang out at the lake with some buddies. And of course, they all just kind of backed their cars in. And, basically they just opened the trunks of their cars, the ones that had a cooler anyway. And, they would just kind of be able to, go to the cooler to get something to drink if they wanted to, and things like that. It was just, I guess it was just easier than, actually dragging the cooler down to the lake, because they basically backed the cars right down to almost right on the actual sand that led to the lake. But this took place, it was a Saturday night, and they were just hanging out, and when they first got there, it was still a little bit daylight, so it really wasn't that big of a deal at the time. But they did notice that, to their right, and this was probably, a couple 100 yards away, they could hear some rustling in the actual, the actual bushes and things like that. But they didn't think much of it. They figured it may have been just a deer or, something like that. At worst, it was a bobcat, but it was nothing to really be afraid of. So they didn't think anything of it, because they knew if it was a deer that it would likely just get spooked and it would run off. And if it was a bobcat, well, I mean, it's really not going to do a whole lot. While bobcats may be a little bit bigger than a traditional house cat, they're not really going to be able to do a whole lot of, damage to a person, and they're not really something that you would need to worry about. My uncle actually said his biggest fear was that it may have actually been a skunk, and that would have definitely ruined their evening. But as the night went on, they actually noticed that the actual sounds kept getting closer. Whatever this was, it wasn't moving away from them, but it kept getting closer to them. And so they knew at that point that it definitely wasn't a deer, because a deer's not going to come closer to someone that's making a lot of noise. But they didn't think much of it, because this is a place that they had been to several times and never really experienced anything out of the ordinary. So they just continued, talking with one another and just hanging out and having a good Saturday night. And after about maybe 30 minutes or an hour, my uncle says this thing had gotten really, really close, meaning that they could almost hear it breathing. And every little shuffle that it made, you could hear it. So at this point, they're really alarmed. They get, my uncle goes and gets in the front seat of his car and grabs his pistol and a flashlight, and they're just kind of looking around for this thing. Because at this point, they're thinking, okay, this is a person, and we don't know what this person's intentions are. They may be here to do us harm, because what else would be getting that close to them? So they're looking for this thing. Unfortunately, this is midsummer, so the overgrowth is very thick. You can't really see anything, and they're too scared to get any closer to where this noise is coming from to investigate. So at this point, they just decide, let's go home. We'll just kind of hang out together there, and let's just get out of here, because we don't know what this thing is. They get in their cars and they start to pull away. And one of my uncle's buddies that had his trunk up, he went to put his trunk down, and unfortunately, for whatever reason, one of the actual handles from the cooler was a rope handle, and it got stuck. So he wasn't able to, close his trunk. So every time he tried to close it, it would basically just pop back up. And once he noticed what it was, he quickly pulled it away, slammed his trunk, ran to his car, because at this point, whatever this thing was, it had came out to where they were, and it was coming toward them. And when my uncle's friend got in his car and started the car up, and then went to pull away, whatever this thing was actually hit the back of his vehicle. It wasn't so much as it pounced on it or anything, but he said that it hit the back of his vehicle. And it was basically on the rear quarter panel on the driver's side. Now, the next morning, when they actually got home, and the next morning when it was daylight, they decided to come out and look at the car, and there was actually a dent in the rear quarter panel where this thing had hit it. They don't know what it was. Whatever it was, they said it was very, very dark. And it kind of mixed in with the darkness that was actually around them anyway. So they could not see what it was. And my uncle actually believes that what it could have been was an actual panther. There have been stories and tales about panthers being around here for many years, though we never really see any. But the thought of something that big and, a big cat is a very scary thing, especially when you don't know that it's there, but it knows that you're there. And clearly it was stalking them because it just kept getting closer and closer. Now, while that's not a ghost story and it's certainly not as scary as a witch, it's one of those things that can happen to anybody at any given time. So it's certainly a scary thing. And, I'm just glad that, my uncle and his friends were able to get out of there and, and get out safely with, just, minor damage to one of the vehicles. Because that I can only imagine how frightening that would have to have been, being there that late at night, and not knowing what it was that was essentially stalking you. But that was three different stories, guys, that I wanted to share with you. And hey, if you enjoyed the content today in this video, definitely leave a like. And hey, down in the comments below, let me know what you think. What do you think that may have been? Was it a panther, or was it a deer? Because the one thing I do know is at the time in this area we really didn't have a whole lot of black bear, so I don't think it was a bear. And really the only thing as far as a large animal that was in these parts, other than that, was a deer. And of course, a deer is not going to act like that. So definitely let me know what you think it may have been in the comments below, guys. And hey, I don't know if you noticed, but I've made some changes to my channel. I'm no longer calling the channel The Horrifying Geek. It's now Campfire Tales. So I do want to thank you for joining me this evening around the campfire. And I look forward to having you guys around the campfire many more times. But, definitely if you like the content, subscribe to the channel. And you have a wonderful rest of your day, evening, night, wherever you are. Have a good one.